Okay, so this recording is about trying to help you through something that's quite difficult. It looks like it shouldn't be because it's just reading, but people tend to find it very difficult to read effectively non-fiction texts, and particularly to follow the argument and the ideas of the writer. What I'm going to do here is take you through this presentation, explaining to you how to approach it. And there are going to be certain points at which I'm going to ask you to pause this this presentation in order to attempt something for yourself. This will then lead into the next piece of work in which I'm expecting you to apply this in tomorrow's lesson. Okay, so the focus here, again, as we've said many times before when talking about reading, is on close reading. It's very, very important that when you are given an unseen text like these will be, that you read very, very closely. Now that will involve certain strategies. Those strategies include the idea of rereading at times. When we read, quite often we drift or we don't pay enough attention to something. We have to be alert to that. I find this as well when I'm reading, that often if I'm trying to get the detail of something, I have to go back and reread a section. So that's one idea. Visualizing is very, very important as well, to try and actually see what they are talking about so you engage yourself with it. So our focus here is on the shape of an argument. It's on how a writer writes an argument. We'll come back to that in a little bit more detail later on. Now we're going to start by looking at the source A that I've provided for you on prisons. Now, at the beginning, you're given a bit of opening detail. I'm straight away going to say to you, focus closely on this. The tendency for people is to ignore it and start reading the main text, but this is here for a reason. Everything it tells you helps you to understand it better. So if we look at this example, the first thing we're told is that this is a man called Paul Vallely, and that he's writing about his experience. Okay. So there we go, it's a first person narrative about his experiences. So his ideas, his arguments are going to come out of his own experiences. His experience of visiting a British child prison and speaking to some of the staff. Well, straight away, what does that tell us? It tells us that he's talking about something that's quite controversial, quite important here. We don't expect children to be imprisoned. Okay, so that is a controversial thing to begin with. And he's going to talk to some of the staff, the people who work this. He's going to get their experiences as well. But we're only going to be interested in what he thinks. And so he's going to be responding to that. That's what we're going to look for. And it tells us it was published in the Independent in 2010. Well, what does that tell us? First of all, it's relatively recent. I know that's 10 years ago, but it's still, you know, it's not a long time back in the past. So we're kind of in a relatively modern society. The Independent, if you recognise, is one of the broadsheet newspapers. So again, it's going to expect to have a relatively well-educated readership. Okay, and as you can tell by its name, it expects to be politically independent. So any of those details you can pick up from that help us to understand what's coming. We're going to read now about the experience of the writer. We're going to read about his experience in somewhere that we, I'm sure, would have ideas about, in a relatively recent experience, and he's going to see what's going on and talk to some of the staff. Okay, now I'm going to take you through some of the key things then when we read this to follow an argument. First of all, we are talking about following it. Don't jump to conclusions. You have to follow what's being said by the writer. One of the key mistakes that people make here is that what they do is decide that their view about the subject is going to be the same as the writer. Okay, you're going to look at British child prisons. The thing to leap to an idea of is it's bad to imprison children, and you're going to expect him to be saying that. But most arguments are quite complex. They don't have a definite answer. They tend to look at things in a bit more depth. Okay, so what we're looking for here is to make sure that you properly understand the way that an argument develops. Okay, you're going to see that it won't necessarily be the same at the beginning as it is at the end. It's going to shift sometimes across the source. They'll start with presenting one idea and then they'll take it in a different direction, not usually contradicting themselves, but it will go into a bit more detail. And in fact, you'll find their main argument often comes much later on in their writing. Now, of course, at the same time, we're also focusing on that skill we worked on before of inference, of inferring, working out a meaning from evidence, not just from the obvious things that are being said. Okay, so you should have source A in front of you now, and this is the opening section of source A. The car turns into the driveway of the large Edwardian house, and I can't hide my look of surprise. I expected barbed wire and reinforced concrete, not architecture and period features. I am immediately greeted with the impression that I've been brought to a luxury spa, somewhere I'd be willing to pay copious amounts of money to stay. However, the car ignores the front door and sweeps on to the low, new brick-built extension hidden behind the house. My expectations suddenly become realised. The windows there are of reflective glass. Outsiders can't see in, but the occupants can see out. In the control room, where staff survey 2 banks of CCTV, the staff press the button to close the shutter. Only when it's clanged back into place are the car doors opened. 2 men get out at the back. So does the small, mousy boy who has been sitting between them. Okay, now what we'll need to do is make sure that every detail of that is noticed, not just the key bits that jump out to you. If you read this in a kind of almost skimming fashion, and for some reason, it's another mistake that a lot of people make when reading here, for some reason, I don't know if it's nervousness or just the fact that they don't necessarily find the subject interesting, they tend to skim through. They'll see the barbed wire, the reinforced concrete. They'll see that there's CCTV. And they'll see there's a boy there. And they can jump to a conclusion but miss the subtlety of the argument. That's what I want to take you through now. Okay, so let's look at those first 3 sentences. What can we discover from this? Well, first of all, it is the first 3 sentences, so be aware that this is how he is presenting to us the situation to begin with. It's very descriptive, okay, but it focuses on his reactions. A look of surprise, what he expects, the impression that he gets of it. So he expects what he would see as a prison, barbed wire, reinforced concrete. And he's surprised because he sees a large Edwardian house, a very posh place. And he tells us that his initial impression is it's like a luxury spa, somewhere he'd pay copious amounts of money to stay. Now that straight away brings in inference. What can we infer about his opinion here? I would be willing to pay copious amounts of money to stay. It seems therefore that the place they are putting children, to him, his first impression of it, is that it seems somewhere he'd like to be himself. Now, we can infer that that's suggesting he doesn't feel that this place is right for them, that maybe it's seems a bit too nice for people who have committed crimes such as this. He doesn't say it openly, but that's what we can infer. After the however, though, and again, please notice in this how many times however comes up. It signals to you a change of direction. It says, I've just said something, however, I'm going to tell you something different. And in these lines, this is what he turns into. My expectations suddenly become realised. He's just talked about what he expected. And now, because he goes past the front door and goes to this new brick-built place, he sees something that goes with his expectations. It's not barbed wire reinforced concrete, but it's this idea here. Outsiders can't see in because of the reflective glass. Occupants can see out. Why are those his expectations? Well, infer again what that says. Why wouldn't outsiders be allowed to see in? Think what might be going on inside. Okay? Think how private that might be. Think how he's suggesting that this therefore is far more like a prison. He carries on. In the control room, staff survey 2 banks of CCTV. Staff press a button to close the shutter, and only when it's clanged back into place are the car doors opened. Again, more about his expectations. Lots of CCTV. He's notably telling us there's 2 banks of them, not just one. So all over the place there's CCTV. They're very careful about closing a shutter and keeping people in place. So having told us his first impressions seem to be that this is somewhere a bit too nice for them, now he's saying, well, here we go. It actually then becomes more like what I expect. And the final sentence then tells us that 2 men get out of the back of the car, and so does the small mousy boy who's been sitting between them. Now, what do I notice there? I notice there the difference between men and boy. It's quite shocking, the idea of 2 men for 1 boy. Okay, in some ways. And then particularly that the description of the boy is he's small and mousy. That does not make him sound very threatening. Okay. So let's have a look at the next section and see what we can come through here. The child is one of the 150 children in Britain today who are so violent they have to be locked up. However, it's hard to believe looking at this boy. He stares around with a look of terror upon his face, trembling slightly at the intimidating security measures. He does his best to look composed, but still looks terrified. I can't help but feel a twang of sympathy towards him when I spot him wiping a tear from his eye when he thinks nobody's looking. He's no longer in control of his own life, and his piteous response will do nothing to change that. Okay, what I'd like you to do now is to try what I have just shown you for this section, to look at the detail and think, okay, what is it telling us about the writer and the writer's views here? I want you now to pause this presentation and attempt this for yourself, and then afterwards we'll go over it. Okay, let's look and see if you picked up what I picked up or something similar. Okay, so I start with the impact of this statistic. 150 children in Britain are so violent they have to be locked up. I would say that that is intended to be shocking, the idea that there are that many people in Britain who are children who are that violent. Once again, it's that word, however. It's a signal, okay? Remember that he is then going to tell us something that opposes that or is maybe on a different line to that, okay? What we call a discourse marker. A discourse marker. It marks where the discourse changes. And what he does is he gives us a description of this boy, okay? What do we get? Look of terror on his face, trembling slightly, trying to look composed but still looking terrified. So this is meant to be somebody who's so violent he has to be locked up, but he presents him to us in the description as somebody who just seems scared. Okay, compare this to what he's just told us. That's what I'm doing. I'm thinking about this, about the place itself. Okay, we get a little bit of empathy for this boy, a little bit of sympathy for him. Okay. He's trying to look good, he's trying to look composed, trying to look tough, but can't. And then at the end, we get the personal response of the writer. He tells us quite clearly he feels a twang of sympathy, not a lot, just a twang of sympathy when he sees him wiping a tear from his eye when he thinks nobody's looking. And he makes this statement: he's no longer in control of his own life, and his piteous response will do nothing to change that. So having looked at those details, what are we told? We're told it's quite shocking there's this many people. We're told, though, that when you look at this example of a child who is one of them, he actually doesn't seem that violent, that worrying. And actually, the writer says he feels some sympathy to him. He makes several times the point that he's trying to look composed. He has a tear when he thinks nobody's looking. And he makes that statement at the end that he's had his life taken away from him. So you can see how his argument is developing here with this particular example. Okay, so on to the next section. And once again, this time I want you to read this through for yourself, and then I want you to pause so that you can again look at the detail and see what this tells us about the writer's views and the way it's going. Pause now. Okay, let's have a look and see what kind of details I picked out from here. I think this is something that I would see as very important for you to notice. This is the writer bringing up something not coming from what he's experienced so far. This is something he says he's recently realised. So this is something he's telling us that he's thought of before. That sometimes locking up children isn't just for the protection of the public, it's for their own good. And he goes on to explain that in the next sentence. That often come from abusive homes and dysfunctional situations, and it allows them to get out of it in that first place. So here is a very key part of his argument that he's introducing. And notice when we started off and picked out bits, this is the kind of thing that you wouldn't necessarily notice. But here's another however. So having said he understands it's for the good of the children as well as for the good of the public, he introduces a however and gives us some information. There's a lot of suicide in these places. There's a lot of assault in these places. And so they're coming under fire, we guess, from media, from people involved, people who care about these things. And he then adds in this comment, very importantly in there, and rightly so. So he makes quite clear he agrees that if there are rocketing suicide and assault rates, then it's right that these places should come under fire. But finishes by telling us that this actually has a good record, and finishes by saying, therefore I'm interested to see if it can swing my opinion further. Now, what is this opinion that he's talking about? I'm interested to see if it can swing my opinion. Therefore, it's an opinion he already has. Can it swing it further one way? Can it confirm his opinion? What is this opinion? Well, he mentioned it earlier, and that's very important for you to have noticed. The idea that it is for the good of the children themselves. He's thinking, okay, will this good place swing my opinion further that it is for the good of the children? So now we're set up with what's going to come next. Okay, the next section is about the boy being brought in to meet the unit manager. I want you to look at this and look carefully. Remember, what the unit manager says is not what the writer says. They can be similar, they can be different. You have to look for the clues in the way that the writer is speaking that tell you what he actually thinks. Pause and read it and try and work that out for yourself. Okay, now one of the things we're going to look at here is that he gives us this description of this unit manager. Appears warm and friendly, but comfortably carries an air of authority. That is what you would want from a manager of a place like this, isn't it? Somebody who seems to be warm and friendly, but actually has that authority at the same time, so can't come over. So he presents him straight away as what we would expect. Therefore, it suggests that, or what we would hope for, therefore it suggests that what he says is going to be something that the writer would probably agree with, because he's presenting a good impression of him. He presents his actual words without comment. We're not here to simply lock them up. It's our duty to allow the inmates to express themselves and develop the skills that will help them find work after release. If they don't grow and develop under our watch, they'll be back here within days of release. Now, that view is very similar to the one that has just been given by the writer. So as well as the description of the unit manager, we can kind of infer that he probably agrees with that himself, right? But the fact he doesn't comment on it suggests we should now look and see what does he go on to next. Structure is always so important. We're not here to simply lock them up. We're here to let them express themselves and develop skills that will allow them to improve afterwards. Right, now what's he going to tell us next? Because if he tells us about examples of boys where that doesn't happen, if he tells us about this particular boy now smashing the place up, or later on smashing the place up, it's going to suggest he's wrong. So what he tells us next is important. It's a short paragraph. Look at the effect, therefore. He's intending it to be punchy and go straight to us. Rehabilitation through art. I can't hide my surprise that this is the key to the success of the prison. Okay? I can't hide my surprise that this is the key to the success of the prison. Keyword again, surprise. He used it right at the beginning. So he seems to be sympathetic towards the unit manager, but he's not initially very sympathetic to the idea that art will actually make these children better. But here we go again, discourse marker. However, this writer does like his howevers. However, my initial skepticism that art can bring about rehabilitation completely disappears when I speak to his colleagues. Okay? Completely disappears. So that skepticism, that surprise, it goes when he talks to colleagues. Now, he's obviously going to tell us about the colleagues in a minute, but it's clear that he's starting to agree with this. I am almost convinced. Remember that idea of swinging his opinion? Continue to swing his opinion towards thinking it's good for them. Now he's almost convinced that time spent here is beneficial for the inmates. Okay, so after that short paragraph, we move to a longer one here, in which he's going to develop this by looking at the manager in more detail. Well, I want you to focus on here. What do we learn from this manager? It's clearly being presented to us that the manager is somebody, a good person, somebody with the right idea, and somebody who, even though the writer is skeptical about his ideas, he's becoming convinced that this is right. So what do we learn from the manager and about the manager, and what is the opinion of the writer in this section? Pause, read, work it out. Okay, so I'm going to focus you in on one line in particular I want you to notice here, and it is the final one. Having given us the words of the manager and told us, he's a social worker, he's got experience, his colleagues say it's a vast improvement since he's been there, all these good things that tell us it's there. Having built up this idea that the manager knows what he's doing, has improved it, he then gives us the manager's mantra. This is the mantra that everybody works at in the prison. The kids found themselves in here not because they're monstrous, but because they're vulnerable. If they're upset, reassure them. If they're angry, talk to them about how they could manage their anger better. Now, it's clear the writer has sympathy with that because of the way he has built up to it. All those things we've picked up about the manager, about his experience, about the improvement, about the kind of person he appears to be. Okay? So, the writer is coming to this idea. The kids are not monstrous, they're vulnerable. So, deal with them in this way. Upset, reassure. Angry, help them manage their anger better. Right? And so we come to the final section, in which he goes back to the mousy boy particularly. Have a read of this, and again think, why has he chosen to end this way? He's pretty much stated his opinion by now. Okay? Why does he choose to end with this? Pause and work it out yourself. Okay, so what are we meant to learn from this exchange? Well, I go to the final words of it. He's not denied time on the Xbox, this boy. Okay? This boy, by the way, who can't believe he has to do homework and other activities after that. But it's that phrase, if you've earned the privilege. This is what the writer chooses to end with. And when you're reading a piece of non-fiction, always consider not just the beginning, but always consider how they choose to end it. What do they want to leave us with? And this is what he's done. Having said that they have this very positive attitude towards them, seeing them as vulnerable, seeing them as people who can be reassured, seeing them as people who aren't monsters, and that their idea is to try and transform them because they're children so that they can come back out into the world and be better citizens. He finishes with the point that they must earn that privilege, and that's how it works. Okay? So, what overall then is his argument? What would I sum this up as? Okay, first of all, he seems sceptical about locking young children away to begin with, but has arrived at the prison with the idea that it might benefit the children themselves. That piece, remember, where he says, I've recently come to that idea. So he's sceptical about the idea of locking them away, but has got the idea that it might be beneficial to them. He also argues that although it seems like a familiar prison in some ways, in other ways it doesn't. Okay. He is particularly surprised that art is so important to helping the children. But he seems to feel that the people in charge have the right attitude. So, when they say that they are there because these children are vulnerable and need to earn privileges so they don't reoffend straight away when released, he doesn't question it. See what I mean about an argument being complex, but also something that develops as it goes through. Now, if you skim read that, you could easily miss the point, and you could certainly miss the subtleties. And it's not good enough to just say that this writer thinks that these are good places because they help children, or to say that he thinks that children in prisons are not are vulnerable but are not monsters. Because remember, that isn't his own phrase, that is the mantra of the place. He just does not question it because he feels the people in charge have the right attitude, we can work out, and because it confirms the idea that he's had recently about the idea of benefiting the children themselves. Okay, I hope your interaction with that as you've gone along has helped you, and I hope that you understand why this is such a complex skill. Tomorrow I'm going to present you with the other source that goes with this, and I'm going to ask you to follow through the same and come up with a bullet point list of an argument like this to see how well you've understood it. Okay? If you struggle with any part of this, go back and re-watch it, and if there are any questions, email them to me. Thank you very much.